Hi everyone. In this second video on personality, we're going to talk about the second of three theories that you will read about in this module. So the first video was on the psychodynamic perspective of personality. In this video, we're going to discuss the humanistic. So this really covers your reading on self and identity. No one specific theory is really talked about in that particular reading. So what I want to do in this video is talk about the more general or overarching theory in which that chapter is about. And so this is the humanistic perspective. And these two theories that I've discussed, the psychodynamic and the humanistic, could really be no different from each other. They are so polar opposites and have really, the humanistic perspective really grew out of the psychodynamic perspective in rejecting much of what it was all about. So while the psychodynamic perspective was about the unconscious mind, kind of had a negative or sick or pessimistic perspective of human nature, and that really at our core, we were fairly self-destructive, either through the superego or the id. The humanistic perspective, on the other hand, says that at our core, we are completely capable and competent and have the motivation to become the best we can be for this self-fulfillment, or what some theorists call self-actualization. And that in doing so, in being that kind of person, we would have a personality that would be flexible, creative, open to change and open to difference, really caring about human connection and caring about the plight and suffering of others, confident, autonomous, right? All of these kinds of positive attributes, that would be an outgrowth of having someone who was self-fulfilled. And so let's talk about some of the more specifics of this particular theory. One particular humanistic perspective, and you will hear about this in your reading, but it's not really talked about specifically, is Carl Rogers' person-centered theory. I want to talk about this particular theory in particular because, as I mentioned in the last video, this one will come up again when we discuss therapy or theories for therapy. Carl Rogers and his particular therapy is, again, one of the most powerful and prominent that you will see today among therapists. And many of his themes are embedded in people's and therapists' processes, regardless of whether they're kind of sticking true to his theory. You will see residuals of it. And so I think it's important to talk about here. His theory is based on self-image. And so in your reading, you will read about all of these parts of self, and that being a person, there is an understanding that we are naturally reflexive or self-reflective, and that by looking at ourselves, thinking about ourselves, that process actually shapes the self. So I have this image here on your screen, and I think it's one of the best to explain or to describe this particular theory, especially if you've seen The Lion King. If you've seen the Disney Lion King, there's a part of that cartoon or movie where Simba is the young lion that thinks he's done something terrible. He thinks he's killed his father. So he leaves his birthright of being king, and he leaves his home, and he goes to other parts of Africa, and he's called on to remember who he is. And there's a scene where he comes to this water, and he looks at himself, and instead of seeing himself, he sees his father. And that image, that reflection, changes his personality. At that point, he becomes brave and, fights for his birthright, cares about his community. And so, as you can see here in this image, in part, how we see ourselves defines us. And so that's really what this particular theory is about. Carl Rogers said that what's particularly important about defining your personality is how congruent your sense of self is, or how incongruent your sense of self is. So we're going to take part of this and do this as an activity for the assignment for this week, where I'm going to get you to think about how congruent or how overlapping are your characteristics of how you think you really are versus how you would like to be, or your kind of ideal self. And if these are incongruent, meaning you have lots of characteristics that might be in your true self that really aren't how you want to be, or you have lots of characteristics up here in your ideal self that you don't think you really are, then there's an incongruent, there's a disconnect between your sense of self. And so this can lead to just the opposite kinds of personality characteristics that I just mentioned. So that can be inflexible, impulsive, aggressive, very kind of egocentric, because of this disconnect, where Carl Rogers said, if those pieces come together, if there's a lot of congruence, not perfect congruence, but a lot of alignment between who you think you are and who you feel like you want to be, then that leads to that kind of self-fulfillment or self-actualization. And that changes, that determines your personality. So it's these thoughts and feelings about who am I? And as your text will say, it's these stories, these narratives that we tell ourselves about how our life choices and experiences have shaped us. And it's really our perception of that. It's the story we tell ourselves that has shaped us, not necessarily the events in and of themselves. And so I know many of you have talked to me already in some of your assignments about how someone like you and maybe a sibling or loved one or family member or friend have gone through the same things and yet have different perspectives on those, and it's changed who you are. This is, again, a point of therapy for this process, is to help people gain a new insight, understanding, or perspective of what's happened to them, and that can change their personality, right? Change the consistent ways in which we think, feel, and behave. And so some really important foundations to personality, and then as we'll come back to these at the end of the semester for therapy, are this genuineness, unconditional positive regard, and empathy. So Carl Rogers says it's not easy in today's world, or any world really, to have congruence, because there's all kinds of obstacles to those. That we live in a world where it can be very hard to be genuine or authentic or vulnerable. And so out of that grows defensiveness, grows denial. And so when we can't really be who we want to be and who we are, then that creates a personality, right? That might be, again, some of those more negative things like rigid, neurotic, and so on and so forth. Part of the reason why we can't be genuine or authentic is because people put all kinds of conditions on our worth. So that if you post something on Facebook, let's say, if you're really genuine, depending on what your network is like, you might get a lot of positive feedback, but you also might get some negative feedback, right? You might get conditions that, no, I will only accept you, value you, like your stuff, be your friends on Facebook if you do this, if you look like this, right? If you. So all these conditions about our worth are placed around us, and so it inhibits our ability to be self-fulfilled. Think about, there can be cultural restraints in terms of gender, sexual orientation, cultural restraints in terms of, no, we will only value you if you go into this particular career even, right? So all kinds of values. So we'll come back to this because Carl Rogers says in therapy, it's key to get rid of all these conditions. And if the therapist shows this kind of unconditional positive regard, then the client, the person, has all the skills, all the competencies, all the motivation to become self-fulfilled. It's just the environment can be very restrictive. And furthermore, empathy. That if we are in situations where we can empathize with others and people can empathize with us often, then again, our true nature, our true self will be exhibited and we will be self-fulfilled. And so if these things aren't in place, our personality can be impacted. If they are in place, our personality is impacted. So really, these three foundational things are what can change one's personality according to this perspective, because they change our perspective of ourself. So one thing I will end on that I hope you can think about for all the theories is an evaluation. Take a kind of critical lens as to how are these true or useful, because in this class we will hear theory upon theory upon theory and it can get overwhelming, like which one is right? Well, I can't answer that for you, and I would argue that there's really no right or wrong, but some theories have more evidence, some theories have more usefulness, and so think about the utilization. I'll say, for instance, that humanistic perspectives have become very popular, particularly in education and in business. If you can try and especially, I mean, think about in education where you have a young child, if you can really value them unconditionally and think that they have the potential for academic growth, regardless of any kind of condition, right, then that can really create a lot of growth and self-fulfillment in a child. Trait theories have a lot of utilization because they're very easy to measure. And so you've probably taken them, as I mentioned earlier on. They take personality inventories like that as a way to assess whether people are competent or good fits for certain jobs. So there's a lot of usefulness and utilization around trait theories, even though there's still a lot of question as to whether or not we really do have traits, and that determines our personality. I think it's important to think about how much do these theories generalize to other cultures. Psychology continues to have a pretty bad reputation, as do many sciences, of doing studies specifically on a very small cultural group, particularly white, middle to upper class men. Now more than the last probably 50 years, it's college students. So, think about the last 50 years, how much can we generalize to other people from college sample groups? So think about the holes in some of these theories as to how they might not really apply and explain behavior in other places, even in our own country, but certainly other countries. Self-indulgence, there's been arguments for the humanistic perspective that if all I'm focusing on is my own self-growth and self-fulfillment, that's self-indulgent. If you go to any Barnes and Noble or bookstore and you see the shelves of self-help books, those were really born out of this humanistic perspective that you are able to change yourself and to be a better person, to grow. That's the humanistic theory. Carl Rogers and many other theorists would say, actually, if you focus on the self and grow yourself, just an outpouring of that will be the growth and care and compassion for others as well. And then finally, how measurable are these theories? And so how measurable they are often determines how much research evidence we have to support them. So Freud's theory is very hard to measure, so there's very little scientific evidence to support his theories. Trait theories, very easy to measure, so there's some pretty good evidence for them. Humanistic theories, for instance, we didn't really talk about how you measure that, but we will do that through an assignment for this week. You do it through life story narratives, where you just have people tell stories about their life and you look for themes about how do they understand themselves, how do they perceive themselves. So a little harder to measure, certainly in terms of objectiveness. So not as strong as research evidence about that either. But I would argue, even as a scientist myself, at the end of the day, it's not always about using the scientific method. There's other ways of knowing, other ways of coming to solid, true senses of understanding. So just some things to think about as you read this week. I hope you enjoy learning about these different theories that try and explain who you are. I hope you can reflect on your own sense of self and come to a better understanding of maybe not only who you are, but why you are that way. So happy exploring, happy learning, everyone. Have a great week.